Hey y'all, today we're going to be reading some scary stories about paranormal experiences that people have had in cemeteries. Why do I feel like I've never made a video about this before? Like, there are endless stories about cemeteries, and I don't think I've ever covered this topic, but I'm really excited for this. I have a couple stories pulled up, and they all seem insane. This first one says, Ghost Experience in Cemetery, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Oshkosh. This experience took place a few months ago in mid-November in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That's really hard to say. My girlfriend-to-be, another couple she was friends with at the time, and I were all hanging out. Being teenagers who enjoyed trying our luck, all four of us decided to take a trip to Riverside Cemetery on the north side of town. Now, I've been to this cemetery searching for stuff myself before, and I never had much more than the occasional expected sign of spirits being nearby, such as white spots or orbs in photographs, or the occasional time where my camera would suddenly say low battery, powering down, even though I always make sure to charge the batteries before stuff like this, or reduce shutter speed, so naturally I thought that nothing more would likely happen this time. However, such was definitely not the case. I could tell the second that we arrived at the cemetery that something was different. There was something about the way the air felt. The atmosphere was entirely different than usual. It was so much more energetic than normal. Anyways, the four of us got out of the car because the other three wanted to look around a bit. I wasn't too keen on this idea at first, but I decided I didn't want to look weak in front of the girl I liked. So we got out. And I brought something I use for communication called dowsing rods with me. They're pretty cool. They're held horizontally and spirits can move them based on questions you ask. If you don't have a pair, I suggest getting a pair. They're a must-have for any paranormal enthusiast. Well, we get out of the car and we began using the dowsing rods. I start asking some questions and then the girl I liked, let's call her Kay, asks to use them, so I hand them over to her. She asks a few questions before the guy in the couple she invited, let's call him H, asks to use them. He then asks a couple more questions, and like the past two of us, the questions are answered, but nothing too extreme happens. At this point in time, the girl in the couple, E, is the only person who hadn't used the rods, and didn't want to, but the rest of us pressure her into it. When she asked her question, though, the rods quickly whipped around to the answer, rather than slowly like for the three of us. So I take the rods back and I ask the spirit if they liked her, to which the answer was yes. Then, because I'm beginning to get suspicious, I ask if it's a benevolent spirit, and the answer is no. I freak out, quickly close the session, and I put the rods away. E is beginning to really freak out too, and I have to comfort her. Meanwhile, K and H wander off in the headstones because they want to do some headstone rubbings. I'm starting to really feel the hairs on my neck prick up, and it's really making me anxious, which is when I began to see things. Out of the corner of my eye, I see black figures fitting in between the headstones, which is making me really nervous. Mind you, K and H were on the other side of the cemetery at this time, and I had a clear line of vision on them, so it couldn't have been them. I tell E, and she and I quickly run to catch up with the others, having decided that splitting up is no longer a good idea. This is where things get really freaky. After a few moments of being out in the headstones, I hear something. It's so difficult to describe, yet it fills me with fear every time I have to describe it. It was a loud scream, off in the distance, and it could have been a person's scream despite the fact it was so animalistic, full of fury and rage, sounded so inhuman from the rasp. The tenor of the scream and the pure fury that sounded like a soul being dragged directly to hell. Not to mention it came from the woods adjacent to the cemetery. I give the others a look, who look back at me with the same expression of pure terror on their faces, and we sprint straight to the car. We begin to take E to her house, and we turn on the GPS and follow the directions. However, it isn't long before E pipes up from the backseat saying, "This isn't how you get to my house." So Kay begins looking down at the step-by-step directions, and she's scrolling down, and the list just keeps going. Kay scrolls for at least 30 seconds, and the directions keep on coming. Mind you, E's house is 3/4 of a mile at most from the cemetery. There's no way the directions were accurate. We follow the directions for a few minutes before we realize they're leading us further and further from E's house, and from town in general. We decide this may not be the best idea, and just have E tell us how to get to her house. We get there, drop her off, and then try to use the GPS to get to my house, and the same thing happens. The GPS gives us endless weird directions, so we turn it off. That scream still haunts me. I wish I could impress upon all of you how tortured, how demonic, and how utterly inhuman that scream was. Furthermore, E would later tell us that night after we dropped her off at her house, one of her favorite plants was thrown off her dresser and smashed on the floor. TLDR, friends and I go to a graveyard, we hear an inhuman scream in the distance, GPS malfunction, malevolent spirit might have been briefly attached to a friend. No, because I'm so sorry, if I was using the dowsing rods and a spirit was like, "Oh, I like this girl," why? Why me? No, you don't. Okay, this one's really short. It's more so just a photo, but I think it's absolutely insane and I have to show you guys. This just says, woman in the graveyard caught on a photo by my dad. My dad went up to Massachusetts and had always loved history. He caught a woman wearing 18th to 19th century clothing. He was the only one there as it was closing up. All pictures were taken back to back. Y'all let me know your thoughts. So this is the first photo, and like obviously they circled the woman, but I'm so glad they posted this close up because yeah, because I feel like from the further out photo, it's obviously just harder to tell. But it's like, it does look like at least the upper torso of a human. And that is insane. That is a woman. That is a woman just standing there menacingly. I don't even understand how that's possible. And then this, I'm like, I don't know if there's even anything. It looks almost misty. And then in this photo, I don't know if I see anything, but I think that's the point, is like he was taking a bunch of photos and she only showed up in one, which is insane and so scary. And then this next one says, I lived behind a graveyard. Yep, that's right. My family's house backs up to a graveyard. In fact, we back up to one of the oldest cemeteries in the state. From my understanding, the land my neighborhood was developed on in the 1970s was originally a fruit tree farm. Each of the homes on the street still has at least one fruit tree on their property as a relic of the farm. My family had an apple tree. I know these stories should always be taken with a grain of salt. I consider myself a pretty level-headed person. My parents are physicians and we operate under a very practical, realistic way of navigating life. And even with that understanding of how the world works, we have experienced things that we're not able to explain. Growing up, the house always gave me an uneasy feeling. I constantly had the feeling I wasn't alone. I've had something knock on my window in the middle of the night. I've heard footsteps down the hallway. I've seen apparitions, seen things flying off tables, had countless other experiences, big and small, that were just not normal. My mom also had interesting experiences, including toys turning on when they had no batteries, being pushed from behind while gardening, and seeing unexplained things from time to time. There would be periods of more activity and periods of quiet. During the active moments, we would refer to the house being loud. It was the loudest when one of us would get sick. Perhaps one of the strangest moments was when we found a bone in our backyard. When the bone was examined by our local forensics team, it was concluded that the bone was the end of a human femur with an unknown origin. They didn't give a date, but they said it was likely several hundred years old. Weirdly enough, we found it by accident. One morning it was sitting on top of a flower bed maybe 20 feet from the house. At this point, the bone is family lore, as we have never been able to explain its existence. There has never been any evidence to suggest someone was buried outside of the cemetery lines, but it certainly makes you wonder. No other bones were ever found. If you're wondering what we did with the bone, well, we kept it. Actually, when the very quick investigation concluded, a police officer came by to drop off the bone. Weird move, but we didn't know what to do, so we took it. Since that moment in 2006, it has sat on the mantle above our fireplace. The bone ended up setting in motion a specific series of events that ended up coming to our family's aid later on in life, so we keep it as a reminder of that moment. That's insane. Like, you just got somebody's femur on your mantle for what? Okay, this one says, experience with ghosts in a cemetery as a kid. Hello everyone, my name's Josh. I'm 26 years old. I was an only child and didn't have very many friends, so I spent a lot of time alone. When I was about 11, I moved in with my grandparents. They lived in a small town, pretty rural, and I spent most of my days, especially on the weekends, outside walking around. There was an old cemetery within walking distance of my grandparents' house that had graves dating back all the way to the late 1600s in the oldest section. The newest graves were no younger than the late 90s and early 2000s. It was pretty run down since the newest graves, like I said, were in the 90s and early 2000s. The oldest section was even more run down since it had graves dating back all the way to late 1600s, early 1700s. I felt bad that these people were seemingly just forgotten and nobody ever visited them. My grandma owned a flower shop and she had a bunch of excess flowers, so I asked her if I could take some to put some on the graves in the cemetery. She agreed and I took about 4 bags full and walked to the cemetery. I got there and started walking and putting flowers on all of the graves. I went through the newest section putting flowers on the graves without incident. I had gotten through about 4 graves in the oldest section when something told me to look up. I look up and I see a woman just standing there, directly behind the grave that I had just put flowers on. She was smiling at me, and she seemed to be so happy. I stood face to face with her for about a minute, and then she disappeared. Then I went on putting flowers on the rest of the graves and left. I think maybe she was just happy that someone was coming to visit. I don't know. Let me know what you think. I think that you are the sweetest human on the planet. No, and she was probably like, and I want to thank you. I want to thank you face to face. Her just appearing because you placed flowers on her grave, that's like actually incredible. Okay, and then this is a Reddit thread that says, people who live or have lived near abandoned places or cemeteries, have you ever experienced something eerie or supernatural? We lived in a pretty small town in Sweden for 12 years, in a big house close to a cemetery, and this place was haunted. It was the first time in my entire life I had seen shadow people in our villa. I never reflected on it until now, actually, and when I saw them, I was fully awake. It was not sleep paralysis. No one died in this house. It was drawn by an architect and his students in the late 80s. It was a splendid, well-renovated house, full of light, open spaces, and so on. But near the garage in our wine cellar, it was always strange energy. I am a fearless, sometimes stupid, sometimes blatantly ignorant, highly sensitive person with ADHD. So the spirituality comes with me always picking fights or being dismissive, messing with the supernatural. And I was always drawn to the darkness, so every time I physically encountered those people, I was just saying hi, or really just observing with a smirk on my face. And then I realized that I had seen something supernatural, and I would just shrug my shoulders. My family members are Christians, so we really had holy water and stuff around the house, and got some blessings on the house as well, but it didn't help. The energy was there. I think I may have brought something with me from the cemetery where I used to run, disrespectful towards the dead, but I was really into running and training for long distance running. Once I also brought a poltergeist with me from a friend, which I got rid of, but that's another story that I need to know about. When I moved out of my parents, I never saw shadow people again in my life. Of course, I got wiser, went into Norse protection spells and spiritual work, and I've seen ghosts in haunted places since then, but never the shadow people. I usually walk through a cemetery on some of my weekends, sit there and sometimes rest, but in my new apartment, it's silent. And this little space has seen a lot of trauma and drama as well. Nothing latched. My folks live now in a nearby town, moved out of the house the summer of 2019, 500 meters from a cemetery again, also with a crematorium. But this cemetery is peaceful and their house is good as well. Our cat likes the house too, so it depends on the location or how close you live, but some places are haunted as hell. And it's interesting how it's like that and why. No, honestly, that is like absolutely insane. And actually really interesting that like you could move from one cemetery to the next and you go from being so incredibly haunted to not, just because it's like peaceful. I don't know. I grew up near a cemetery. The cemetery was about a block away from my house and it had a large playhouse type building called the Hall at the edge where people would rent it out for parties. Weird place to host parties. My aunt and I had a cleaning job, cleaning the building after events. We would go at 4 a.m. and clean. One morning, someone threw a massive Halloween party and it was trashed. There was a stage in the building that they blocked off with butcher paper. We went onto the stage to remove it. The stage faced the front entrance of the building. We were on the stage behind the paper to pull it down. Since we were behind it, we couldn't see the front door. As we started to pull one side down, the front door, which was locked, all of a sudden swung open and the most massive gust of wind blew the paper towards us. At the same time, we heard something running across the entire hall and towards the backstage stairs where we were. We were frozen in terror, thinking somebody was breaking in and we were about to be murdered. We sat there as still as possible, just listening. Nothing. No more sounds, footsteps. Finally, we got brave enough to slowly creep down the stairs. To our shock, there was nothing there, and the front door was still locked. We noped out of there so fast and waited till light to finish the job. I stopped going after that. It scared the hell out of me. Yeah, it would scare the hell out of me. It's scaring the hell out of me right now. The front door swinging open, and a gust of wind, and the running, and then for it to be locked, like it didn't even happen. Okay, I would be like, I'm losing my mind. I live next to a massive cemetery in Washington State. It's all flat, has water features, statues, sitting areas, a crematorium that recently burned to the ground, and the brick walls collapsed in a fire this February, and the like. The cemetery is well kept, except the leaky water pipes everywhere that flood the graves constantly. Maintenance does a shoddy fix, and it leaks and leaks everywhere, weeks later. I walk the entire cemetery once or twice a week. I've seen and heard unusual things over the 8 years that I've walked here. One time, my friend and I were cutting through to get to my place around 9 p.m. It's not well lit, but we could see. We heard multiple people at once whisper out of nowhere, all something we couldn't make out. It made us both stop and ask one another, what the fuck we just heard? We tried to listen and didn't hear a damn thing. We continued down the path and were about 25 feet away from the start of a public sidewalk in the end of the cemetery. We heard the whistling begin. It was loud, not a jovial tune, and came out of nowhere. We were knees to chest running to the sidewalk when we hear something run past us, running on the sidewalk. Sounded like flip-flops on pavement, running. We made it to my house trying hard not to outright scream the entire way. Another instance of something happening at that cemetery was when I was walking the paths. This place is entirely flat and you can see anyone who visits. I'm walking my dog and I see a toddler running down in between the graves and disappear behind an electrical box 15 feet away from me with no one anywhere near our vicinity. I immediately run over with my dog thinking it's a loose child, and I see not a living thing anywhere. A haunted baby toddler ghost. Oh, that's my worst fear. I hate ghost children. I hate them. Okay, and that's all I'm gonna read for now. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys have any creepy cemetery stories or any paranormal stories in general that you want to share with me or the community, I will have my subreddit linked down below. I'm not gonna ramble at the end of this video only because I actually leave for Dallas this coming weekend. I'm filming this like way ahead of time, but I'm also like panic filming because I like to be ahead a certain amount of videos, and for some reason, I just feel like I don't have any time even though I do. But I'm going to Dallas. I'm really excited. I'm not going to like visit anyone other than my cousin. Like, I'm not going to visit like my old friends in Dallas because I'm not friends with them anymore. But I'm gonna go see my cousin. I'm going with my family. It's gonna be a good time. It's gonna be so much fun. I'll let you know if I have any stories when I get back. So I'm gonna go. But I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.